So guys, I've taken the PR7 ships out for a spin after their new phase simulations, and here are my findings. First up, let's talk about Daisen. She originally had an alternating bonus effect to her barrage, rotating between a special burn and a bonus torpedo barrage, which are now activated on every barrage. Her recon plane also increases her personal damage against 3 enemies now, up from 1. While this is certainly an upgrade, I don't think it will be too noticeable because the torpedoes don't have the best hit rate, and her unique burn, which is quite strong by the way, doesn't show up on the end screen. As for the recon plane, I was mostly using her in single target boss fights anyway, so that doesn't change much either. As it stands, I believe that her relative ranking stays about the same, being the best of the gold battleships when it comes to single target damage, about the same as Warspite and New Jersey, as well as FDG and UVH against light armor, but I would still choose Rodney Meta or Tamaki over her for campaign, due to her lack of AoE and lack of mechanics to prevent her from overkilling a weak enemy too much. Although consistently having a torpedo barrage should shore up her deficiency there. I had hoped that they would make her heal activate even when her recon plane wasn't shot down, but that would have been a little too good I guess, and with how much it heals, Rafaela's job would have been in danger. If they want to keep a bit of a gap between gold and rainbow ships, then it makes sense not to make her too strong, but then I don't think she should have had this heal in the first place since it just doesn't come into play 99% of the time. If in the future there is some kind of content that makes this heal relevant, I fear for the implication of actual carriers having their planes shot down. Next up is Bayard. She was already very strong to begin with, so it makes sense that all they gave her was a few % extra damage by increasing her buffs a bit. When it comes to my evaluation of her performance based on controlled tests in 13.4, having her 15% damage buff independent of her HP is going to be pretty noticeable because she's quite tanky and stayed healthy throughout 13.4 runs, but if you're progressing through campaign using her, chances are she would have been chunked anyway, so it's not nearly as noticeable. Once again, if they pushed it a little further, she might have ended up being as good as Plymouth and San Diego, which they probably want to avoid. She's easily on par with them as a stat stick, but obviously lacks the extra support that they provide. Now that I think about it, why are there only 2 UR light cruisers? It's about time we go on a streak and pump out 5 UR light cruisers in a row. Slightly off topic, but still about PR7, I also tested Napoli once again. Now, when I tested her before, it was in the context of a raid battle with only a single enemy, where she was outperformed by Brest, a large cruiser that is not exactly known for her damage. However, with the combination of her ability to ignore armor, as well as all of her ammo piercing enemies, that kind of test ended up underestimating her damage, especially in campaign, by quite a bit. So I sorted Bayard and Napoli together, 2 ships that are really on the opposite ends of the spectrum in how they dish out damage. Bayard constantly fires a ton of bullets through her barrages, and her damage is good just due to the sheer volume of stuff she's throwing out. Even though her damage is already amazing in practice, on paper her damage looks even better when you don't account for a lot of her barrages missing enemies and most of her damage being severely handicapped by enemy shields. Napoli, on the other hand, has some of the most pathetic barrages I've ever seen in my life for a ship of her caliber. The stats backing up her guns aren't the most impressive either, but it is made up for by being able to consistently pierce enemy in late game campaign stages while completely bypassing their shields. As a result, the gap is much closer than it would seem in practice. Testing them side by side with +10 equipment, just because I don't have 2 + 13 Plymouth guns, I found that Bayard with her Fate simulation has about 20 to 30% more damage than Napoli. Some caveats to consider here are that Napoli's damage is completely reliant on her equipment, so she benefits much more than Bayard from +13 equipment. Chapter 13 also doesn't have as high enemy density as chapters 14 and 15, so Napoli would get even more pierces going on there. Finally, Napoli is much tankier than Bayard, who is already quite tanky to begin with, so Napoli could use 2 offensive auxiliaries to bolster her damage while still being about as tanky as Bayard with 0 offensive auxiliaries, and that would certainly close most of that gap. In conclusion, I definitely underestimated Napoli's damage in campaign due to her poor performance against a single enemy, so I'm going to move her into the A tier. ahead of Bayard, who is another ship I would probably use exclusively in campaign, because Napoli's extra bulk is more likely going to be the difference maker than Bayard's extra damage. I think I'll put her just behind Guam, because I find that most players would probably benefit from having a fully developed Napoli than Fushun and Taiyuan, although the level of investment is obviously much steeper for Napoli than the DDGs. Even with such a limited selection of ships, I still miss a couple things here and there, so let me know if you guys spot anything else that seems to not match your experience. You might actually be onto something and help me find a blind spot. Last but certainly not least, probably the biggest change was for Halford. For most of the past year, she didn't have an airstrike at all even when you equipped seaplanes onto her third slot due to a bug that was fixed a couple weeks before her fate simulation, but I don't think it really mattered anyway. With the bug, she had the performance of a purple destroyer, and with the bug fixed, an unremarkable gold destroyer. However, with the fate simulation, alongside the small upgrades to her buff from her red skill, which are typical for fate simulations, she also received a bonus which simply says, improves this ship's airstrikes, but the effect is that it straight up doubles her airstrikes output. Now, with this upgrade, you should never use anti-air guns on her, as the seaplane is a huge part of her damage output. Due to her anti-air slot being occupied by a seaplane instead, testing her alongside a typical destroyer is a bit more difficult since she does not contribute to the anti-air circle, so I can't just rig their anti-air stat to make sure they get credited with the same amount of anti-air damage. Her end-screen damage does have a little bit of anti-air because the best seaplanes for her, the F8F Bearcat, does have some interception capability, so that damage is factored into her end-screen damage, while other destroyers will be credited with the anti-air damage from the combined anti-air circle of the fleet. I decided to test her against Kawakaze Meta, since Kawakaze Meta is not only a benchmark level gold destroyer, but also one of the rare ones I still have at level 120. I just kept Kawakaze's anti-air to a minimum, while increasing the anti-air of the main fleet so that Kawakaze's anti-air damage would be mostly negligible, hopefully cancelling out the little bit of anti-air damage from Halford's interception. I feel like both of them should barely deal anti-air damage, but honestly I have no clue how much exactly each of them are getting from anti-air, and whether or not it's heavily skewing the results. Alright, looking at the results for a quick comparison, it seems like Halford dealt over 80% of Kawakaze Meta's damage. This might not sound too impressive if you've never used Kawakaze Meta, but keep in mind that a non-oathed level 120 Kawakaze Meta deals more damage than a maxed out level 125 Kawakaze with her unique augment, as well as Felix Schultz and so on. So it's really no shame to be dealing a bit less than her while having slightly higher EHP, not to say that Halford is tanky by any means. Using Halford as a simple stat stick, which means just to deal damage and survive, I would say that she's now in the upper echelons of gold destroyers. Keep in mind that because so much of Halford's damage comes from her airstrike, upgrading her seaplane to plus 13 is going to be quite a lot more important for her damage, whereas other destroyers just stick some random anti-air gun and don't have to worry about that. Upgrading her seaplane in the age of LA9s and potentially skip bombers to come out in the near future is quite a poor proposition, so only do it if you really love Halford. Also worth mentioning is that her cannon damage increase is now a universal damage debuff, and the duration is also increased as well. The timing interval is not ideal at 15 seconds, but the first debuff is a little bit later than 15 seconds since her seaplanes have to travel for a couple of seconds to the enemy first before applying the debuff. This debuff does give her a bit of an edge in boss fights over other stat sticks, but she's still a hard sell over the plethora of better options. Before I forget, one place where I think she could be very useful is if her aviation stat is able to put your fleet over the threshold for airspace supremacy, compared to some other normal ship. She's a solid ship on her own, and that difference in airspace superiority benefits all the ships in all of your fleets. I think she has a good chance to be added to the B tier of my tier list, but I want to use her a bit more first. Alright, that's it for the PR7 Fate Simulations. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.